Welcome in everyone to UGA Football Live. It is 1:45 a.m. Eastern, Saturday, November 30th. We just witnessed one of the greatest games of my lifetime, possibly and probably the greatest Georgia Tech game ever played. Game started in 1893. A first half that was maybe the worst Georgia we've seen all season, i.e., Alabama and Tuscaloosa. Happens at home. Eerie game, Black Friday. We talked about it earlier this week. How does the crowd show up? How do the players react to a short week, 6 days to rest after UMass? And they show up flat as a pancake. I'm talking flat like one of those iron presses. Just put 5,000 pounds of force on that Georgia team. That's how they showed up for this one. You have 137 yards of total offense in the first half. You had a fumble. You had a missed field goal. Georgia Tech does whatever they want to do on offense. And not just whatever they wanted to do, it looked easy to do it. Like as easy as you could possibly be. I still don't know how, with weeks to prepare, because Georgia looks at this offense during bye weeks too. Right. So Georgia had already looked at this Yellow Jackets offense, which, Buster Faulkner, former UGA assistant, does a great job. But it was so interesting to me how Georgia looked so unprepared for that game against that offense. And Haynes King with the QB zone read, just perfect decisions by him when he wanted to pass it. They were open. They were good passes. And you just looked unprepared. And additionally, just the poor tackling. So we saw that against UMass. We saw it in Georgia's losses this year where poor tackling are apparent. They're glaring. Like you've been watching football for a year and you can tell something's going on with that defense. And it kind of what set the tone, which oddly enough was the first play of the stinking game, a 44-yard rush by Georgia Tech in the offense. I mean, Georgia had that play snuffed at the line of scrimmage. I mean, you wrap up and that's a 1-yard game, maybe, right? 44-yard game. Pops out, 44-yard game. And that was the story of the first half for Georgia and that defense. They did get away, with a stop on downs, a stop on the missed field goal, right? So it could have been worse. And for that second half, it could have been a worse deficit for Georgia to face. And going in that second half, folks, I was already planning, what my headlines should be for Athlon Sports writing about a loss for Georgia. You had a 30-game home win streak. Hadn't lost to Tech since 2016. Right? It was just been an incredible loss. And my back of the mind, I'm like, well, SEC championship, you're already locked in there. You can still play for a playoff spot, an automatic bid. Right? And I don't know what happened in that locker room, which I'd love the SEC network, if they were in there, to release. They probably won't release the best parts because those include some choice words, I'm sure. But hopefully we get a glimpse onto what was said, because the intensity Georgia came out with in the second half was so different. I mean, just on both sides of the ball, you could tell. I mean, the offensive line was just nasty. I mean, getting after it right to the end of the whistle, sometimes after the whistle. The defensive line, which, both sides of the ball for Georgia up front were getting whipped in the first half, which makes no sense, folks. I mean, these are blue chip recruits with a lot of experience, especially on the offensive line for Georgia. I know Ron Freeling there at left tackle, freshman, but he's played really well, a highly recruited guy. But other than that, I mean, you have tenured guys on the offensive line. Defensive line, kind of same story. I mean, that Georgia Tech offense, who really struggled to run between the tackles against NC State last week, had so much success. I mean, and whatever they wanted to do, played really, really well. And maybe that's a Brent Key effect, former Georgia Tech offensive lineman. Very, very, very passionate guy, coached those guys up extremely well. Maybe that was it. I don't know. But the intensity in the second half for Georgia was different. And it's kind of the same story. It's a little scary if you're Georgia fans. If you're a hardcore Georgia fan, that was not a fun game. And I don't blame you at all. I mean, good grief, just the heartache from really the first snap of the game, right? That 44-yard rush. It was like, oh, here we are. We're in for it, right? Um, but again, I mean, would that second half have happened if Georgia didn't almost come back and beat Alabama in Tuscaloosa? They knew they had what it takes to put that comeback together. But they also knew that they had to get stops and they had to get as many points as possible, i.e. the 2-point try, which why did they go for 2, right? Because Kirby Smart and that Georgia offense and Mike Bobo and all those analysts thought, and they were probably right, we're not going to get as many possessions against this team, especially in the second half, right? They put a 10-minute drive together in the second half. 10 minutes. After that drive, folks, I was like, okay, Georgia can't stop the run, right? Even though they're playing with more intensity. Can't stop the run, really. The passes are open because the run's so open, right? Play action, getting the eyes in the wrong spots. Buster Faulkner, so good at that. Haynes King executed to perfection. Malachi Starks, All-American, 2-time All-American, getting caught, looking in the backfield, right? So Georgia knew the possessions are limited. Let's go for 2 here. Obviously, it bit them. It bit them hard. If they would have made it, we probably wouldn't be talking this late because it probably wouldn't have went in overtime. But that's how kind of scared Georgia was of that Georgia Tech offense and that kind of option attack that they've run. And it's interesting to me because, I mean, why are you so scared about that or worried that your defense is going to get taken advantage of? And I think it's because of the trust of the offense. I think Georgia knows they don't have many playmakers right now. And those playmakers that they do have are dropping the stinking football. 4 drops tonight, 2 by Arian Smith. Another one that wasn't his fault. It was a tip ball by Dylan Bell in the end zone. Would have been caught. Georgia would have won that game a little earlier. Dylan Bell, Dominic Lovett. That's your top 3 receivers they're dropping passes. And those were drive killers in the first half, of course. So Georgia goes in the second knowing that, hey, our playmakers are dropping passes. Carson Beck is making the good decisions. Yeah, sure, he had a couple that he liked back, but they didn't end up in Georgia Tech's hands. 5 touchdowns tonight, 0 interceptions. Really good stuff from him. I mean, he has turned a corner as far as his decision-making without trust of his own receivers, which is I'm impressed by. And I'm also impressed by the defensive front, of course, in the overtime, and stopping. Remember that penalty on a PI, which you were looking at that play really, really closely for you call a PI in the end zone there. Sets Georgia up. I'm thinking, oh gosh, Georgia Tech's basically going to have, a QB sneak here with a really, really good running quarterback that's rushed for, what do you do? Don't have it up here. 100 yards. Rushed for like 25 times. This is going to be a Georgia Tech win on a QB sneak. And that Georgia front answered. They stopped him right there. I was like, oh my gosh. Like that should have been a Yellow Jackets touchdown, but based on how they run the ball, they answered. And the why I bring that up, them answering it, is because player of the game for me, folks. And yeah, I'll give you Carson Beck, 5 touchdowns, 297. Already told you I loved his decision making 90% of the time tonight. I'll give you Nate Frazier, who did some good things. But Dan Jackson almost won this game twice for Georgia, right? Now, the tip pass that Dylan Bell accidentally tipped and would have been an Arian Smith touchdown, that would have, capped it off right after this Dan Jackson play. But Dan Jackson, fumble, right? That was Georgia needed a turnover in regulation. They needed a turnover in regulation, right? Limit possessions. You're down. And on offense, you really can't stop. And who knows if Haynes King wouldn't have fumbled that ball, are we even having the same discussion? Probably not. All things considered, consider Georgia Tech running for 260 yards tonight. You having this discussion right now, if Dan Jackson does not put a hat on a ball, it's perfect tackling. Now, there's other people out there that are going to talk about targeting, right? Was that textbook targeting? You listen, I could see yes, I could see no because it's in the scrum, right? You're right there with 4 different offensive linemen, a bunch of D linemen right there in your face. You're going to call targeting there. I haven't seen one like that right on the line of scrimmage. I haven't seen that call before. But of course, your Tech fans and really all the other fans who want Georgia to lose, which is absolutely everyone. Georgia fans, let me tell you something. You are the new Alabama when it comes to other teams and other fan bases and everybody and their mama wanting you to lose. That's where you're at. So you see a lot of stuff, take it with a grain of salt. But that's what they used to teach as far as picture perfect tackling. Hat on a ball, baby. Hat on a ball. Dan Jackson does the exact thing that he should have done in that space. Comes down hard. He's always been physical, but in his last game as a Georgia Bulldog in Sanford Stadium, has not lost a game in his career in that stadium. He comes up with that play in regulation that gave Georgia a chance to tie the stinking game. Now, you fast forward to overtime, and Dan Jackson gets an overtime changing sack. I mean, this kid played his guts out, and guts is a good word here because that's what Georgia did. Took a lot of guts, right? Just think about how many plays, just not even minding the offense and how many plays they ran. Let's just look at the plays. Georgia Tech ran 84 plays. And think about that offense and how they run it, right? Hard-nosed, physical, pulling guards every stinking play. You got to take hits. Your linebackers are taking hits. Your DBs are taking hits. Corners are sometimes on an island. Think about all that in 84 stinking plays, and your front was good enough at the end of the game to stop those guys. I know one thing, that Georgia staff is proud of that. Maybe above all is just how they were able to stay in the game despite 84 plays, 6.7 yards per play, facing that for 4 quarters plus 8 stinking overtimes, the second longest game in college football history. That's impressive, and that's a good sign. It's incredible having this conversation in the first place. And if you're a Georgia fan, you're going to hear, oh, Georgia does not deserve to be in the playoffs. Georgia, they're going to lose next week, and they almost lost to Tech. We should just boot them out anyway. That's, of course, what you're going to hear because you're new Alabama. What I would add to that is it's a rivalry game. It's at home. You're coming off a 6-day week. SEC championship already locked down. It's not like we saw a new Georgia team tonight. It's happened before. But Georgia finds a way to win most of the time, 10 times to be exact, 2 losses. This game has, if you have to point one thing out of this game, I think it would be tackling early. I think it would be offensively, are you getting your playmakers the ball? But they dropped it. So how can you really think, okay, we're not getting our guys the ball? You are. They're dropping it. They fixed it in the second half for the most part. Dominic Lovett had some big-time catches in the second half after some bad drops in the first. Those things can get cleaned up. Now, you face an issue if you get into a game, and this is where the looking ahead situation comes into, is can Georgia do that against really good teams and still win? They did it against Texas, won by 15 on the road. They had those issues against Tennessee, took care of business. A lot easier than it happened tonight. So that's my question, though. It's such a weird season because it's not like this team has gone through a period of growth to where kind of the execution things and what we talked about, the tackling and the drop passes and getting your eyes too locked in the backfield and getting beat over top and stuff. It's weird because that hasn't, improved really. You see good quarters and bad quarters, good quarters and bad quarters, and it's so inconsistent. That's the scary part. But your best is better than other teams' good. Right? And I don't think there's an elite team in college football. I mean, you could say Oregon, they played Ohio State. That's it, right? I mean, we were banking on Ohio State being good just to think, oh, Oregon's good. So I don't think they're an elite team. I don't think there is an elite team in college football. But if you can give your best for 3 or 4 quarters, I think Georgia is going to have a really good chance to get really far in the playoff. And SEC championship, we've seen A&M look bad at times. We've seen Texas been bad at times. Texas has to go on the road to College Station. It'll be a really interesting game, and I'm sure all of you guys are going to watch it because that's who you're going to be playing in Atlanta next week. But I like Georgia as far as matchup against both of those guys. Obviously, we know what happened against Texas. Now, it is hard to beat the same team twice, of course. But A&M on the other side, I mean, that's a struggling offense. Running quarterback, that should be the number one thing. If you're a Georgia fan thinking matchup taking Texas A&M, Marcel Reed, who can run the rock, and a good defensive front. That's what they provide, right? But as far as skill guys, I'm taking Georgia all day. Quarterback, obviously, decision-making late in games. I'm taking Georgia there with Carson Beck and how he's throwing the rock right now. His decision-making is key. And overtime, the decision-making. I mean, dropping off to Cash Jones when, I mean, you're really tempted to force the ball in the end zone in overtime like that. Makes the right reads, right? And I think that was the first one. That Georgia needed a score. You know how Tech runs the ball. I thought overtime was a bad matchup for the Bulldogs just because how they were running the ball. He sees the blitz. He gets it off the Cash Jones. That's a first down. Next play, Georgia uses a show me shift to tell Carson Beck, what is the defense in man zone, what have you, who's blitzing what. And Beck knows it's in zone. And to beat the safety over top, throws it on a rope to London Humphreys. Best decision you could have made. And it was a good throw. And thank God London Humphreys caught it, which is always scary watching Georgia games this year. Balls in the air, you're like, well, I hope so. But the decision making is really good. That's what you want. And Georgia being battle tested so much this year, it has to pay off. I think it's going to pay off at some point, depending on how the games go. If Georgia has a chance in the fourth, you should feel pretty comfortable. You really should. As a fan, as an SEC fan of a team like that, in a close game, if you're like me, you like joyless murder ball, I call it, which is basically 30-0 in the first half. I'm playing my backups by the fourth. That's what we like. But you're in a close game. It's not going to be too fun for your heart. But Georgia has what it takes, the guts, what it takes, the execution, I think, to win those games. And we've seen that all year. So that's the positive outlook on this, other than 44-42. Georgia wins in overtime against Tech on a Friday night. I mean, that's beautiful. You're 10-2. You're headed to the SEC championship. Even if you lose, there's probably a good chance you're going to be in the college football playoff, right? So think about what you felt like at halftime, 17-0 against a 4-loss Tech team. Think about that, and I'll think about what you're feeling now at 2:03 Eastern time. We've set a record for the earliest, I should call it, UGA Football Live show of all time. So thank you if you're a real one, if you're watching right now. And it's so interesting. I want to add this too before we get off. Is Arthur Lynch came on this show earlier this week, and I asked him purposefully about Georgia Tech in 2013. And you might want to look this up for your own viewing purposes, but that was a 2 overtime finish. Georgia was down 20-7 at halftime. Georgia scored 34 points in the third quarter through the 2 overtimes to win 41-34. Tonight, or last night, I should say. Last night, Georgia was down 17-0, scores 44 points in the second half plus OT combined. Now you think, well, we should do that in the first half. Well, life is not that easy, and it's not that predictable. And football isn't either. A lot of moving parts. A win is a win. At this point, against a rival like Tech, I think as your Georgia fan, you should feel good about that. You should feel good about how this team plays when the back's against the wall, because that's going to be SEC championship. That's going to be playoff football, unless you're playing maybe Boise State. No offense, Boise State, but you're in the Mountain West. Ashton Genty, I love you. But unless you're playing a team like that where you're severely outmatch them in every position, but maybe running back with Ashton Genty, you're going to be in these games. Your back's going to be against the wall. And being that battle tested, i.e. more than maybe an Oregon who's had one true test. I'm not talking Wisconsin here. You beat them by a touchdown late, but still. I'm talking Ohio State, you beat them by a point. That's really your test. Georgia's been tested so many times this season. And that's a good thing to take to heart ahead of this Georgia, whoever, Texas or Texas A&M matchup in the SEC championship. And I bet one thing too, Tennessee fans were watching this game so closely. I thought all the referees tweet, and I'll end on this. This is a good place to end. The penalty situation. Listen, I watched this game and I get on Twitter and I wrote a post for Athlon Sports, kind of, college football world's reaction. Go check us out. Check me out if you can. Appreciate it. And I see all the reactions about the penalties. Now, of course, I already admitted earlier, I could see a targeting on that Dan Jackson hit. I've never seen one called in the scrum at the line of scrimmage right there at 1 yard with, 5 different offensive and defensive linemen right there on you. Never seen that one. The pass interference, the holding in overtime or the right in regulation, right? The calls went both ways. Yeah, sure, there were some controversial ones that went Georgia way. There was also controversial ones that went Georgia Tech's way. The PI, it stands out. That should have been PI on Dom Lovett there in the end zone overtime. It wasn't. But that's okay, because I came away with it as you lose some, you take some. That's how the game goes. That's how the officials, I think, called it tonight. There were some calls you could go either way on both sides, and that's the game we play. That's life. But of course, because you're the new Alabama, fans they're gonna focus on that. Oh, Georgia was given the game. Didn't see it that way. I try to be objective as possible when it comes to those things. Call it like I see it. You might think it's a different way. That's just how I see it. And I think we have some commonality there, to be honest, with what I'm hearing from Georgia fans so far and this early morning of Saturday with a full college football slate ahead. Absolutely. So if you're watching this on X, Facebook, Twitter, YouTube, wherever you choose, I appreciate you hanging out with me. Apologies for being so tired. It has been a long day. I know Georgia's tired. 84 plays on defense. Good grief. Got a long week of recovery ahead of you. And Georgia and its staff is going to be watching that game in College Station tonight. 7:30 kick, I believe. I'll be watching closely. Whoever wins that game will be Georgia's opponent in Atlanta. But I appreciate you for checking in with us here. UGA Football Live Instant Reactions. Another Georgia win. We're really close to it to being a bad night, but it's a better one because of some really gutsy play calls, execution, and defensive stands by the Bulldogs against Tech. Clean old-fashioned hate. It got a lot more interesting, and I can't wait for next year's matchup. Brent Key's got these kids moving to a really good direction. I absolutely love Haynes King, just an absolute gamer. I hope he succeeds in whatever he does in life because he's an absolute gamer. And with that mindset, I think he's going to do really well in whatever he chooses to do. And with that, we'll see you next time. We'll see you next week to preview the SEC Championship. Make sure to check out Texas A&M tomorrow to see who the Bulldogs play. Have a good morning, folks.